This is a guy who's always been very loyal to people who flatter him and will throw anyone under the bus the minute they don't. And I think the North Koreans, like the Saudis, like the Russians, they worked that out a while ago. This is how you get to Donald Trump. And you have Donald Trump saying these kind of, you saw just now in that tape, he says, I think he's a very, very smart man, at the same time as he accuses the former vice president of the United States of being low IQ. And I know we've played this game before, but can you imagine if Barack Obama in 2011 had said, oh, the Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran thinks Mitt Romney's low IQ and I'm totally with him. The Republicans wouldn't just be demanding impeachment, they'd be calling him a traitor and demanding execution.
We begin with our world lead, what was supposed to be a show of unity between the U.S. and Japan. Instead, President Trump contradicting his host, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, not to mention his own national security advisor. The president saying he was not personally bothered by North Korea's recent missile tests. Mr. Trump also siding with the brutal North Korean dictator over a fellow American, former Vice President Joe Biden. CNN White House correspondent Caitlin Collins is traveling with the president in Tokyo. So, Caitlin, Prime Minister Abe said he and President Trump were completely on the same page on issues like trade and North Korea, but that's not what we saw.
Yeah, this was a heavily ceremonial trip that was meant to showcase and reinforce the bond between these two leaders. But, Erica, when they got on stage and started taking questions from reporters, the cracks in that bond over key issues became very obvious.
President Trump's trip to Tokyo was brimming with pomp and pageantry.
The First Lady and I will never forget this gracious invitation.
But no red carpet could hide the sharp divide between the two leaders when it came to North Korea.
You're not bothered at all by the small missiles?
No, I'm not. I am personally not.
Putting him squarely at odds with his national security advisor, John Bolton, and one of America's closest allies in Asia, who both agree that North Korea's recent missile tests violate UN resolutions.
My people think it could have been a violation, as you know. I view it differently. I view it as a man, perhaps he wants to get attention, and perhaps not. Who knows? It doesn't matter.
But it does matter to Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe.
This is violating the Security Council resolution.
The president is holding out hope Kim Jong-un will eventually denuclearize North Korea.
He is a very smart man. He gets it well.
And viewing it all through the lens of a real estate developer.
It's located between Russia and China on one side and South Korea on the other. And it's all waterfront property.
The president is also refusing to back off his endorsement of Kim Jong-un's criticism of his potential 2020 opponent, Joe Biden.
Kim Jong-un made a statement that Joe Biden is a low IQ individual. He probably is, based on his record. I think I agree with him on that.
Trump brushing off concerns he's siding with a brutal dictator over a former American vice president.
I can tell you that Joe Biden was a disaster. His administration with President Obama, they were basically a disaster when it came to so many things.
Now, the president flatly disagreed with his national security advisor, John Bolton, during that press conference and his assessment of North Korea. But when the president was walking out and he was asked, do you still have confidence in John Bolton? He said yes, that he did. But, Erica, we should note John Bolton was not present at the banquet last night with the emperor.
Caitlin Collins live from Tokyo for us. Caitlin, thank you. And now let's take a deeper dive. Mehdi, as we look at this, there is the question of the message, of course, that this sends. You have the president standing next to a leader who is supposed to be an ally, siding with North Korea's dictator. Mehdi, what is that message?
The message is that Donald Trump, once he likes you as a foreign dictator, and once you flattered him, he will have your back. This is a guy who's always been very loyal to people who flatter him and will throw anyone under the bus the minute they don't. And I think the North Koreans, like the Saudis, like the Russians, they worked that out a while ago. This is how you get to Donald Trump. And you have Donald Trump saying these kind of, you saw just now in that tape, he says, I think he's a very, very smart man, at the same time as he accuses the former vice president of the United States of being low IQ. And I know we've played this game before, but can you imagine if Barack Obama in 2011 had said, oh, the Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran thinks Mitt Romney's low IQ and I'm totally with him. The Republicans wouldn't just be demanding impeachment, they'd be calling him a traitor and demanding execution.
You're right, we have played that game before. And yet, here we are again. What's fascinating, though, is as we listen to each of these in their own words, and I want to play a short part of what President Trump said about Kim Jong-un. Take a listen to this.
I view it as a man, perhaps he wants to get attention, and perhaps not. Who knows? It doesn't matter.
Mary Catherine, does it matter?
Yes, it matters a lot. And this, to me, this week is Trump playing into every argument that 2020 candidates will make against him on the Democratic side in the most perfect way. You've got immaturity, you've got volatility, and one that is particularly concerning to me and always has been is the possibility of foreign policy via tweet. By somebody who is impulsive and who doesn't make great decisions and who often doesn't have a real tuned moral compass when it comes to dictators, right? So this is a real problem, and it's a problem that he and Bolton aren't on the same page and that he's talking about that in public overseas. And by the way, the Pelosi stuff is stateside political pugilism, and you can say it's out of bounds in certain ways. Overseas on Memorial Day weekend, it's just wrong, man.
It is. You can't ignore the timing on it, Mary Catherine, and you are absolutely right. You did bring up, though, John Bolton, and we heard from Caitlin. It was Pamela Brown who asked, actually, at the press conference if the president still had confidence in Bolton. He said yes. Ron, though, do you think this relationship is in danger here?
Well, look, I mean, they were never on the same page ideologically to start with. And so, you know, I'm not sure that this really changes that dynamic very much. I mean, what to me, and everyone kind of runs out their string with Trump. I mean, there's no one who works for him who, you know, doesn't share the last name, who has kind of like extended tenure. I mean, to me, the real point of this week was to underscore the dynamics of the relationship between Trump and the North Korean dictator. I mean, the president has gone so far out on a limb in insisting that his personal relationship is what can untie the Gordian knot that frustrated, you know, so many previous presidents from Clinton on, that he is in a position where he has to make this work. And I think what the North Koreans realize is how much leverage that gives them, because Trump is, because of his desire to show that he alone can solve this, is going to bend over backwards, as he demonstrated again this week, to forgive almost anything the North Koreans do. I think there's no question, you know, who is the pursuer and who is the pursued at this point in this negotiation.
Well, you know, Ron, to your point, too, that really puts in context what we heard from the president in terms of Joe Biden. I'll just play it again for folks who may have missed it.
Kim Jong-un made a statement that Joe Biden is a low IQ individual. He probably is, based on his record. I think I agree with him on that.
Sarah, that's a stunning statement for a number of reasons. But in some ways, it's not all that shocking that we're hearing it coming from the president.
I mean, I think it still is a stunning statement because this is Kim Jong-un we're talking about. I mean, we're not talking about, the French president thinks that this of Joe Biden, and I agree with the French president. I mean, this is Kim Jong-un. But on the other hand, you know, it's not surprising in the sense that President Trump doesn't think about the things he's saying as sort of, what does this mean for the presidency? What does this mean broadly for diplomacy? What message am I sending as the president of the United States, agreeing with the leader of North Korea over, you know, his view of a former vice president? He thinks, oh, great, Kim Jong-un is on my team. We both agree that, you know, Joe Biden is a low IQ individual. How great to have another person in my corner. And President Trump, and this was true when he was a candidate too, doesn't really care who you are or what you believe or what you think or what you've done in the past, as long as you are supporting him and you are vocal in that support. And that is one of these things that has not changed about him.
Also, I would say, as an ally, it doesn't, as the ally of the Japanese, it doesn't help for them to sort of flaunt the fact that, oh, we're much further away from the North Koreans, so we don't have. I'm not super concerned about it. Well, of course, Japan's concerned about it. They're right there, guys. I mean, you know, not helpful.
You know, in the flood of daily kind of outrages and controversies from Trump, there are very few that I can imagine making it all the way to 2020. But this, as Mary Catherine was saying before, this so encapsulates the arguments that you're going to hear from Democrats against them that I could imagine this being, especially if Biden is the nominee, Biden using this to kind of really kind of encapsulate the case against Trump, that he is willing to, you know, that he is so focused on his own interest above the national interest that he's willing to give credibility to a brutal, murdering foreign dictator in order to score a temporary political point against an opponent at home. I think this is something that is actually going to last, and we will hear about it in the general election of 2020.
Just on a substantive point, can we dwell for a moment on the idea that Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump are the people who are going to decide who has and who doesn't have high IQ?
Yeah.
I'm not going to touch that one, but I do want to bring up. Mary Catherine, in all seriousness, I do want to go back to one point, which is just piggybacking off of what Ron was just saying, and you brought this up in the beginning at the top of the hour here, in that, look, we're used to President Trump ignoring the norms, right? Doing things his own way. That is not surprising anymore. But there is still something to be said for a sitting president who takes the campaign overseas. Typically what we've seen, if a president is going to run for re-election, the campaign stays at home when he's traveling abroad for the country.
Right, and it should, and it's not a norm or a line I think he's going to start observing, although he should. I mean, if you're not observing it on Memorial Day weekend, when you're having a press conference with an ally overseas and talking about Kim Jong-un, I'm not sure when you're going to observe that. And I do think, look, that is one of the things, like I said, fighting at home is something that we do, and that many have died for the great right for us to run our mouths at each other and insult each other on our homeland. But generally, when you step foot overseas, you're supposed to keep it within the family. And he's not willing to do that. And it is something that I think when it comes to more moderate voters, certainly those suburban and ex-urban women voters that he tends to lose, that's not something that will play great with them. And I agree with Ron that a lot of these things don't have staying power, but this is perhaps one that goes a little further and may. But who knows these days?
Yeah. But it's been several months since he said in West Virginia in a rally, I think it was September, that we wrote each other letters and we fell in love. That in itself should have been the moment everyone went, what? A US president, a Republican president, is saying he's in love with the dictator in North Korea? And the crowd just cheered and Republican members of Congress said nothing.
Yeah, and you can, and you can very easily imagine how this can be taken from the other, how Democrats can come on from the other side in this. Again, basically making the argument that Trump has climbed so far out on a limb that he's basically surrendered too much or all of America's leverage over North Korea, because they realize he is so reluctant to in any way allow for the possibility that all of this was for naught. And that gives them a lot of leverage and puts them in a position of excusing a lot of their behavior that another president simply would not.
Speaking of Democrats, President Trump now saying he would be willing to work with House Democrats even while they're investigating him. So the big question, of course, what changed? More of our live coverage is next.
We would like to commence.
I think that we will work with them. We have a USMCA. We have a deal with Canada and Mexico that everybody wants. I would imagine that Nancy Pelosi will approve that. I would think it would be very hard not to, but we'll see. But certainly as things get approved, I would love to sign them.
President Trump reversing course now, as you just heard. He says he's willing to work with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi despite ongoing Democratic investigations. The shift comes on the heels of some stinging personal attacks last week, lobbed by both the president and the speaker. CNN's Phil Mattingly is live. So, Phil, the president said Democrats need to focus on areas of cooperation like lowering drug prices and trade. Is there any traction there?
Yeah, Erica, one of the most striking things about the sudden legislative freeze declaration last week is what was actually happening behind the scenes. Just over the course of the couple days prior, there had been ongoing bipartisan discussions with the White House that had broken some new ground on a budget agreement. There had been behind-the-scenes discussions between Speaker Pelosi's staff and White House staff on prescription drugs, trying to coalesce around a proposal there on the USMCA, the so-called #1 legislative priority of the Trump administration. Speaker Pelosi had just told the trade representative that she was going to designate working groups to work with the administration on their outstanding issues. So there actually had been work going on and some progress made on a lot of those issues before the president called for a freeze. I think the complicating factor here is the difficulty with both Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill knowing exactly where the president is on these issues. These issues are all complicated. These issues are all difficult. And all of these issues are going to need not just White House buy-in on the whole, but the president himself to be involved, to be present, and to try and figure out a path forward for them actually to reach an agreement. USMCA, I think, is the one that they expect something to happen on if something occurs. But a reminder that through all the kind of back and forth of last week, Speaker Pelosi decides whether or not the trade agreement ever comes to the House floor. And therefore, the relationship is necessary, no matter how fractured it is. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is why you saw the president at least kind of partially walk back what he had declared just a few days prior.
Maybe it's extending a tiny little olive branch.
A little bit.
Perhaps. Phil, good to see you. Thank you. Ron, especially as Phil laid it out there are still a number of questions. But how, if at all, does this rhetoric that we're hearing from the president today, this offer, saying he's willing to work with Democrats, how do you think that changes the strategy for Democrats?
I think it changes very little. I mean, I think first of all, the first step of all of this is that Mitch McConnell is refusing to consider any of the legislation that House Democrats are passing, right? I mean, they identified their, top 10 issues, and they've been moving through them. I think they've passed 5 of them now on the floor. There've been a total of 2 negative votes among Democrats on things like universal background checks, climate change, political reform, equal pay, the Equality Act on same-sex couples at work and in housing and so forth. And McConnell is refusing to consider any of them. So there's very little that has prospects of getting to the president in the first place. And, I wonder, I know Phil, is obviously more plugged in than any of us on the day-to-day, but whether Democrats who see the primacy of winning back the 3 blue wall states in the Rust Belt that tipped to Trump in 2016, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, are going to give him a victory on the renegotiated NAFTA without exacting some of their own priorities in return, since that is the one thing he really needs to have from Congress in addition to a budget deal. That seems to me unlikely that they will give that up without getting something back. And right now, both the Senate Republicans and the administration has shown very little interest in advancing any of the priorities the Democrats are passing.
There's also the issue, as Phil laid out, of the president himself. We know he is mercurial and that he can change focus, change tune very quickly, as we heard in just the last few days. In fact, just to remind folks, this is what he had to say just a couple of days ago about Nancy Pelosi.
She's a mess. Look, let's face it, she doesn't understand it. And they sort of feel she's disintegrating. Crazy Nancy. I tell you what, I've been watching her, and I have been watching her for a long period of time. She's not the same person. She's lost it. You think Nancy's the same as she was? She's not. Maybe we could all say that.
And listen, as we've pointed out, too, Nancy Pelosi did hit back a little bit. She was questioning the president's fitness, questioning whether folks around him are paying enough attention, Sarah. But as we look at this back and forth, there is a very real question of whether the commitment lasts, as Phil pointed out, and where they take this. So, Sarah, how do you think that is being weighed today?
Well, I don't think it was anyone's finest moment last week when the president was calling Nancy Pelosi crazy and Nancy Pelosi was saying the president and his family need to have some kind of intervention. So I do think that both sides realize they need to move beyond that point, because it doesn't look good for anyone, frankly, if they just get nothing done, if they're stuck in a stalemate. I mean, Democrats are also trying to get the president out of the White House. They want to elect their own candidate. And if they essentially get nothing done, if they don't have anything they can even champion as their priority, they have a problem, too, as to what they stand for going into 2020, aside from just defeating President Trump. That said, the president's stance of, well, no one's doing what I want, the investigations are continuing, so I'm not going to play nicely with anyone, that is not a re-election message. You can't just say, I'm taking my toys and going home when you're the president of the United States. That's not how it works. You still need to run the country, even if there is another party that controls the House, and even if that party is investigating you. And that's been true for every other president who's been under investigation.
In terms of those investigations, Mary Catherine, the Trump team suffered some significant legal losses in terms of these financial documents. And there's a good chance, let's be honest, we're going to see some of that. At this point, how much does the American voter care?
Well, I mean, so part of the issue is that this was to some extent litigated during the 2016 election. He was elected without giving his tax returns, which I have always said he should give. But he did not, and voters weighed that. So it is part of it. They are not as interested as many in media thought they were. They may be more interested now, but I'm not sure. The game has changed when it comes to what voters consider about this particular person.
It's a fair point. Go ahead.
I think Mary Catherine is right about how you weigh things up, and we don't know what they're interested in, although we know more now than we knew then about, his billions of losses, the accusations of, money laundering, the Deutsche Bank in-house investigators who flagged certain suspicious activities. Things have changed in that sense. Just on Pelosi and Trump, though, can I say something that I know, Erica, you and Sarah might not be able to say, but let me just say, he's not mercurial, he's unwell and unstable. And this isn't about both sides. Yes, Nancy Pelosi said there should be an intervention, but most people who have worked for Trump have come out and said that after leaving office, either on or off the record. He, on the other hand, put out a video saying Pelosi stammers through news conference, which still sits on his Twitter account last time I checked before I came on air. An outrageous edited video to make her look bad and crazy. And everything you played in that video just now was classic Trumpian projection. She's crazy. No, he is. She's changed over the years. No, he has, as we've all seen. And I think this is a real problem. And for Pelosi to say, family and colleagues should intervene. I'm sorry, let's talk about this impeachment debate that the Democrats are now having internally, finally. The idea that the Speaker of the House is calling on Mike Pence, Ben Carson, and Melania Trump to save the Republic when House Democrats should actually be starting impeachment hearings is absurd on her part.
All right, we're going to leave it there for just a moment, but stay with us. They are all vying for the party's nomination. Welcome back to this live special edition of The Lead, our 2020 lead now. We are less than a month away from the first Democratic debate, and candidates on this holiday weekend are in full campaign mode, focusing, though, less on each other and more on attacking President Trump. As CNN's Rebecca Buck reports, the president may be overseas, but he's still at the center of the 2020 race.
What a crowd! This Memorial Day, the 2020 field is spread out across the country in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Bend, Indiana. President Trump keeping his focus on the race even during his official visit to Japan, taking a swipe at Democratic frontrunner Joe Biden in a tweet praising North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. The tweet drew a swift response from Democrats like Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Foreign policy by tweet does not work.
And Beto O'Rourke, who called on Trump to end these love affairs with dictators and strongmen. A Biden aide responding to CNN, calling the president's tweet unhinged and erratic. How you doing? While Biden's rivals jumped in to defend him.
Kim Jong-un is a murderous dictator, and the Vice President Biden serves this country honorably.
The former vice president was off the trail this weekend, but that isn't stopping another candidate from partaking in a favorite Biden treat.
I was speeding up the line there.
Senator Bernie Sanders.
Get people out here to scoop.
Cooling off with 3 ice cream socials in New Hampshire on Monday, after turning up the heat on Trump during a Vermont rally this weekend.
We have a president who is a pathological liar.
In Iowa, Senator Amy Klobuchar also taking aim at the president on Saturday, recalling a moment with the late Senator John McCain at Trump's inauguration.
John McCain kept reciting to me names of dictators during that speech because he knew more than any of us what we were facing as a nation. He understood it.
John McCain's daughter, Megan, weighing in today on Twitter, asking Klobuchar to leave her father's legacy and memory out of presidential politics. And we're here with Cory Booker in Iowa as he wraps up a 4-day swing through the Hawkeye State. This week, the candidates will head west for a Move On Forum on Friday in San Francisco. And of course, Erica, we're only 1 month away from the first Democratic presidential debate. Erica?
Clock is ticking. Rebecca Buck in Iowa today. Rebecca, thank you. We just heard a little bit there from South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg weighing in on the president's comments about Joe Biden. I want to play a little bit more, though, of what he had to say. Take a listen.
Kim Jong-un is a murderous dictator, and Vice President Biden serves this country honorably. It's just one more example, though, of the way that this president tries to draw attention to himself by saying things that shock the conscience, to distract us from his deep unpopularity and the deep unpopularity of the Republican government in general.
Mehdi, what we just heard from Mayor Buttigieg, is that how Democratic candidates, you think, should handle any attacks from President Trump?
Definitely, and I think they have to stick together because Trump is going to try and single them all off and take them out one at a time whenever he thinks who's up and who's down in the polls. Right now, we know that Trump and his team are worried about Biden, so you see these absurd comments. And, I think Democrats recognize that there isn't a big pro-Kim Jong-un constituency in American politics, and therefore it's easy to defend Biden against such attacks. They're all going to be turning on Joe Biden fairly soon if they haven't already. The debate's, I think, a month away. Biden's the front runner. At some stage, they're going to have to train their fire on him, but they'll do it, I assume, in a more measured way than saying that the dictator of North Korea thinks he's low IQ. There's much to attack Joe Biden for. Legitimate stuff. This isn't it.
It's interesting you say they have to stick together because at least one Democrat sticking together, going after Vice President Biden. Take a listen to what Bill de Blasio had to say.
That crime bill was one of the foundations of mass incarceration in a very painful era in our nation's history. And I think, look, the vice president and anyone else has to be accountable for every vote they take and what's on their record. And I think that was a huge mistake.
You know, as Mehdi points out, at some point the gloves are going to have to come off for the candidates here because each one of them, of course, wants to win the nomination. Sarah, is there a sense, though, of when that moment is, especially as the clock is ticking towards this first debate?
Well, I think people are starting to sort of inch in that direction. Bill de Blasio is sort of in a lane of his own because I think he kind of needs to punch up in order for anyone to pay any attention to him. I mean, most stories you read about Bill de Blasio are about how even New Yorkers don't want Bill de Blasio to be president. So I think he's got a different situation, but you're going to see more candidates like that who are going to punch up. I think, you know, there's a difference in saying I'm going to side with Kim Jong-un on this than pointing out legitimate sort of policy differences. And I think in the Democratic Party to see Joe Biden come out there and say, you know, the crime bill didn't have anything to do with mass incarceration, that was one of those things where I did a double take and thought, you know, is anyone else in the Democratic field paying attention to this? And I think that is going to come back around and you are going to see legitimate policy differences. And that is what the primaries are going to be for. Those will probably turn nasty at some point, but I think they start on the policy front.
Well, and what Trump doesn't want to do, not that he has a strategy, but what he doesn't want to do is act in such a way that gives them a way to easily unify. I mean, 23 candidates, it's hard to unify them, but if you go after Biden, who's former vice president, on foreign soil in such a way, it will give them that way to do that. But eventually this is going to get a lot uglier.
Ron, go ahead.
You know, I say if Biden wins the nomination in 2020, it would be 50 years after he was first elected to public office in Newcastle County, Delaware in 1970. That would be the longest span in American political history between first election and first nomination for your party, whether a Democrat, a Republican, or even a Whig. And de Blasio's comments are really indicative of the kind of problems that creates. I mean, the crime bill in 1994 occurred in a very different context. In New York City alone, there were over 1,000 murders, as I recall, that year. And every leading African-American mayor in the country wrote a letter supporting the bill as the Senate was considering it. But aspects of that bill, in hindsight, look very different. And they look very different to this Democratic Party. And I think the kind of the changing context is one of the reasons why the most prominent note in the polling about the early Democratic race is this unbelievable age gap, where Biden is just kind of in the middle of the pack among voters younger than 45. But older than 45, he's usually leading by 4 to 1 or more in both national and state polls. And ultimately, I mean, that seems like a divide that could last, given the kind of the length of his career, and be one of the driving factors of this race.
It's also true that a lot of old people vote. So even
60% of the primary voters in 2016.
Whether
60% of the primary voters in 2016 were
whether
over
it
45.
lasts, we're so far out from even Iowa, let alone the actual general election. And people keep making the point, but it is true the only way he has to go is down. We haven't had the debates. He's notoriously gaffe-prone, and his record, his record is bad on a lot of fronts, not just mass incarceration. It's Memorial Day weekend, the Iraq War, which caused so many problems for Hillary Clinton. He's the only candidate running in the field who voted for the Iraq War. His relationship to big finance. There's so much to go through, and I think that's a real problem for Biden once you start going through that track record. I think Bill de Blasio had every right to point that out.
So you're all saying that we have a long way to go here?
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
In all seriousness, yes, we do. We're going to have to leave it there. Appreciate it as always. Just ahead, it's one of